All right. Hello again, adventurers, and welcome to another exciting episode of Discovering the New Dragons. Join me as we discover what may be your new favorite RPG. So, today we are going to be talking about the G.I Joe RPG. That is the third one of the Essence 20 games that I've been covering for, it feels like forever at this point, because of everything has been going on. But once we're done with this, we get to go crossover stuff. So that should be super cool. Quick reminder, if you do enjoy this, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon to turn notifications on. All those things are super important. Let's talk about the history of G.I. Joe. Now, I mentioned this is the third Essence 20 game that we've covered here, and I've technically, unintentionally covered them in reverse age order. What I mean by that is Power Rangers as a series and just as a franchise started in the early 90s, either 92 or 93. And it has existed aside from, I think it was a single year where there wasn't a new Power Rangers show in production. They just re-aired the first season with really bad editing. But it's been going every year since 90, I want to say it's 93. And it's been doing really well. But other than that, there was a comic series that started in 2015 that massively started expanding the lore and things like that outside of what was shown in the TV show. The next one I did was Transformers, which started in the mid-'80s. And it started as a cartoon and a toy line. And this was an extremely common thing in the 80s, is you would create a toy line and then you would come up with some sort of media to sell the toy line. A lot of times it was a cartoon. That's where things like He-Man came from, Jason the Wheeled Warriors, Visionaries. Like, it goes on and on and on and on. They were TV shows that were meant to sell toys. And Transformers was one of those. Around the same time, they also had a comic series that has been going off and on ever since then. You want to guess how old G.I. Joe is? The first iteration of G.I. Joe was a comic, and actually a comic strip as opposed to a comic book. And it was first published in 1942. That's right. G.I. Joe has been around for a very long time. Now, the version that was published in 1942 looks nothing like the RPG. And the actual series that the RPG is based off of didn't show up until 1982, 40 years later. And it had a subtitle of A Real American Hero. And that's where the idea of G.I. Joe being this kind of paramilitary organization somehow associated with the U.S. military and fighting against this terrorist organization known as Cobra. That's where that whole thing came from. And the unique thing about G.I. Joe compared to something like Transformers is it started as a comic book and toy line. And then the TV show didn't show up until 1985 and only lasted for about a year. 1985 to 1986 is when the G.I. Joe TV show aired. And it did about as well as a kid's animated TV show could do. But it was the comic books that were the real driving force of the G.I. Joe brand moving forward. The comic books and the toys, obviously. So yeah, before the Real American Hero, they had the action series. Fun fact, the term action figure actually comes from the first G.I. Joes that showed up in the 62, I want to say it was in 62? Let's look. 63. Or 64, finally. They were called America's Movable Fighting Man, and there was 4 different versions. Now, the G.I. Joes that we're used to are 3.75-inch action figures, only about this big. The original G.I. Joe action figure was a 12-inch tall thing that kind of looked like Ken. And there were 4 versions. There was the Action Soldier, the Action Sailor, the Action Pilot, and the Action Marine. The Action Soldier was meant to emulate the U.S. Army. Action Sailor was the Navy. Action Pilot was the Air Force. And Action Marine was the Marine Corps. No love for the Coast Guard. I'm trying to see, because I can't actually remember. Yeah, no, it was around. I was sitting there going, because I know the Coast Guard technically came a little bit later than other ones, but it was 1915 is when the Coast Guard came out. They just decided that the Coast Guard didn't need any advertising. Everybody else did. So anyway, yeah, and because they were heavily associated with the American military, when they went to, and again, it was called America's Movable Fighting Man, in the U.S. When it went to the UK, it was just called Action Man. And then Action Force when it started expanding. So that particular line of toys technically still exists. It's nowhere near as popular as the 3 3/4 inch figures, and it doesn't have anywhere near the lore. They're just military people. So yeah, interesting stuff about G.I. Joe in general. Just the fact that it's been around since the 40s, and it is the oldest of all of the Essence 20 system stuff. Even My Little Ponies didn't show up until I think it was 84, 85. So G.I. Joe is the one that has been around the longest. It has the most amount of lore. And speaking of lore, let's move on. The actual lore of the game and the thing that you could expect to do when you're creating your character. In the world of G.I. Joe, G.I. Joe started as, again, this kind of American paramilitary organization, and relatively quickly turned into this international organization that wasn't tied to a specific government. And its purpose is to fight against the terrorist organization known as Cobra. Cobra are the bad guys. G.I. Joe is the good guys. Now, one of the unique things about G.I. Joe compared to any of the other Essence 20 systems is G.I. Joes are exactly that. They're just regular Joes. None of them have superpowers or anything like that, or at least they weren't originally designed to have superpowers. All of their impressive abilities and things that make them seem really amazing comes from specialized training and a lot of equipment. So when you are building a Joe, one of the things that you look at is a Joe has a life and a career before becoming a Joe, compared to something like the Power Rangers, where a lot of times they're just kids that are thrust into this, or you're going to the Transformers, and while yes, they did have a life before the war, it's heavily integrated into what they are now. G.I. Joes have an entire career before becoming Joes, because they eventually get approached by the G.I. Joe organization, and they're only approached because they are exceptionally good at something, and the G.I. Joes need to use that. Another kind of unique aspect of the lore is G.I. Joe is not built around a central character or a central party. There isn't even a regular team. Like if you look at Transformers, there's a lot of different Transformers, but Optimus Prime is always going to be there. Even each series is centered around a very specific team. G.I. Joe is never like that, lore-wise. And it actually operates very similar to what we now call in modern RPGs a West Marches campaign. If you're unfamiliar with that term, there's a lot of history behind it that I'm not going to go into, but the basics of a West Marches campaign is it is a campaign world where either a single DM or multiple DMs will run games in the same campaign world, and instead of having an established party, anytime a session is about to happen, they will go, hey, I'm going to run an adventure, and this is kind of the stuff you're going to deal with. who can play, and then they pick characters based on the mission itself, what skills you're going to need, and the people that are available. So in a West Marches campaign, you may be adventuring with a completely different party every single time. Kind of modern versions of this on a grand scale are living campaigns, things like Living Forgotten Realm, Pathfinder Society, Shadowrun missions, and then obviously the big one now is the D&D Adventurers, the Little League. They kind of work in a very similar way, and that, lore-wise, is how G.I. Joe operates. Someone in command will go, hey, I've got a mission, and I need a specific set of people with a specific set of skills. They will go through the roster of Joes that are available, and they'll go, I want this one, this one, this one, this one, and those Joes will be brought in to do the mission, and then they'll break up again and go back to doing other things. So when you're playing in G.I. Joe, one of the biggest parts of the lore is that you are a single part of a much larger group of people, and you're going to be fighting against Cobra. To go more in depth on the lore would be in another 2 or 3 hour long video in and of itself. The basic premise is very simple. You're the good guys, Cobra's the bad guys, we're done. But as you follow the comics and things like that, because you have effectively a very large ensemble cast, different characters would get different emphasis in the comics, and they would get backstories, and it becomes kind of a convoluted mess if you want to follow absolutely everything going on. But the basics of the lore are, you're a Joe, you work for the G.I. Joe organization, you say, go Joe, and then you fight Cobra. So yeah, again, significantly more complicated, but I would spend the majority of this video talking about it, and I don't want to do that. So, moving on. Let's talk about dice rolls and mechanics. This is another Essence 20 game. The Essence 20 system is one of my current favorite systems because there's a lot you can do with it. And from a GM perspective, there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of reward interesting ideas at the table without needing to look up a rule for it or anything like that. The basics of the Essence 20 system, which is what's happening here, are all of your rolls are a d20 roll plus skill dice. All of your rolls are skill rolls. There aren't attack rolls, there are might rolls or finesse rolls or targeting rolls. There aren't persuasion checks. There are social skill rolls that I can't remember any of the social skills right now, and if I lose this page I will never find it again. So I'm not going to do that, and I wish it would let me do multiple things. So social, so you have persuasion and deception and streetwise and animal handling and performance and all those fun things. So yeah, everything is a skill roll, and the way the skills rolls work is you roll a d20, which I have a d20 right here. You roll a d20, and then you add your skill dice to it. And depending on how many points you've invested in a particular skill, your skill die gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Starts as a d2, which is just a coin flip. You either have a 1 or a 2. But then it goes d4, d6, d8, d10, d12, and that's as large as it gets just from training in it. And so what you do is, let's say you have 3 points invested in a skill. You would have a d6 and a d20. You roll them together, and that's all you do. There aren't additional floating modifiers or anything like that. It is entirely based on the roll of the d20 and your skill dice. Now, it does get a little bit more complicated as we start talking about edges and snags, shifts, and specializations. Edges and snags are, if you've played the D&D 5th edition, it's the advantage-disadvantage system. An edge means you roll the d20 twice, take the higher of the 2 rolls. Snag means you roll it twice, take the lower of the 2 rolls. Edges and snags only affect your d20. Shifting affects your skill die. Like I said, depending on how many points you have in the skill, you will have the die will get bigger or smaller. Shifting is in the heat of the moment, or maybe due to an ability you have, you actually get to change that die before you roll it. So if you normally have a D6, but because you are in an advantageous position for this particular roll, you're going to get an upshift. Now you roll a D8 instead of a D6. Same thing can be true if you're in a disadvantageous position. Instead of rolling a D6, you might get a downshift 1. You only get a D4 on it, or maybe using the alternate method of damage for one of your weapons, and because of that, you're trying to do something special, so it shifts you down 1. It's a really interesting system, and depending on how many shifts, you can get multiple shifts, and you can shift yourself all the way to automatic successes or critical successes, and you can shift yourself down all the way to automatic failures or automatic critical failures, which are called fumbles in this. As far as fumbles are exactly how they work in most other RPGs. You roll a 1 on your D20, and you fail this is a skill check. You get a fumble. Not only do you fail, but something additional bad happens. However, your team also gets a story point because you're going to learn from your failure. We'll talk about story points in just a second here. For critical success, that's one of the unique things about the Essence 20 system is instead of having to roll a nat 20 on your D20, you just have to roll the highest number on your skill die. Other than the D2, you cannot get a critical success if your skill die is a D2. But if you have a D4 and you roll a 4 on it, as long as the check succeeds, that is considered a critical success, and much better things happen. On an attack roll, you might be able to inflict your damage twice or use one of the alternate damage types for free on it. On a persuasion check, maybe you get a not only do you get the result that you wanted, but you make a new friend and they say, hey, if you ever need any other help, here's my cell number, just give me a call. Things like that. Now, that becomes even more interesting when you start talking about specializations. Specializations are something that you're particularly good at when it relates to a particular skill. So if you were Snake Eyes, you probably have a pretty high finesse score because that's what you use to use your katana. But you're really, really good with katanas in general and just bladed weapons in general. So you have a specialization in bladed weapons. That means any time you roll a finesse check with a bladed weapon, not only do you get to roll your skill die, you get to roll every skill die underneath it and take whichever one of these skill dice is highest. So if you normally would have a D8 and you have a specialization, that means you roll a D8, a D6, a D4, and a D2 and take whichever one of those dice rolls the highest. In addition to that, remember how I said critical success, you have to roll the highest number on your skill die? Well, if you're rolling it specialized, if any one other than the D2 rolls the highest, even if you don't use that, it counts as a critical success. So specialization is a massive, massive thing in the Essence 20 system. And then we talk about story points. Story points are the other kind of final thing. You can use story points to do a lot of different things. Re-rolling a nat 1. Rolling a skill test as if you were specialized in it. So you don't have a specialization. You can burn a story point to do that. You can increase your defense. You can get temporary access to a piece of equipment that you use. There's a lot of different things. It's basically a, here players, here's something useful for you. And the players get to decide it. And the players have a shared pool of story points that anyone can use. So that's the basics of the dice rolls and mechanics of the game itself. The basic thing is always going to be a D20 plus your skill die, and then you add things onto that. But for the most part, as complicated as it sounds, once you start playing, it becomes very, very quick and easy to get any rolls that you really need to. So that being said, let's move on. The next section, character creation. Now, the reason I did this one last is from an RPG standpoint, the Power Rangers RPG is kind of as close to what I call a skill-based system as you're going to get in Essence 20. Do they still have classes? For those of you wondering, a skill-based system does not mean you have to be good to be able to play it. A skill-based system means that instead of investing in taking a class and that's how you get all your cool abilities, you invest in different skills. There's some kind called classless RPGs. Power Rangers is closer to a skill-based RPG than something like Transformers. You do have a class, they call it roles in that, but a lot of the customization for your character comes from the various perks that you choose, and you get a lot of different perks in the Power Rangers RPG. You get general perks, you get Zord perks for your particular Zord, and you also get power perks or something similar to that. I can't remember what it's called, but they're basically Power Rangers specific things. So there's 3 different versions of perks that you get in Power Rangers. And because of that, that is where a lot of the customization of your character is going to come from. Your role is going to define some of what you do, but it's going to be defined as much, if not more so, by the perks that you choose as you level up. Transformers is the other kind of extreme. Transformers not only has classes, but they also have subclasses. The classes are called roles. Subclasses are called focuses or foci. So you choose a role and then a focus, and that really is going to kind of gear you towards how you're going to play. G.I. Joe uses the same role and focus system that Transformers uses. But again, because G.I. Joe is not meant to be a bunch of superheroes, to be perfectly honest, you're not getting a lot of your most amazing abilities from your role or focus. A lot of times the abilities you get from your role or focus are going to make you better or give you different ways to use your equipment. And that's where G.I. Joe really, really focuses on your customization, is the equipment, which fits into the lore of G.I. Joe where, yeah, you are specially trained, but we're going to make you specially trained by giving you really, really cool science fiction style equipment to make you that much more awesome. G.I. Joe has the largest equipment pool of any of the Essence 20 systems. They have a modular armor system, which doesn't exist in any of the other Essence 20 games. And they have more vehicles available than any other Essence 20 system. And that all fits in with how G.I. Joe just works. G.I. Joe, from its inception, has all been about, selling the new vehicle that you can put your G.I. Joes in, and then the new Joes that comes with a flamethrower this time or that. Like, it really screams G.I. Joe when you start looking at just how much equipment. And as I've mentioned many times before in designing the new dragons, the cool thing about the Essence 20 system is your equipment is going to define your character as much as their role, as much as their influences, and every thing. So equipment is a very big part of the Essence 20 system in general, and G.I. Joe is where equipment goes crazy. So when you're creating your character, you are definitely going to be spending a long time in the equipment section. Moving on. Let's talk about monsters. In the Essence 20 system, monsters are called threats. And threats in G.I. Joe is a little bit different than the threats in Power Rangers and the threats in Transformers. Threats in G.I. Joe, there are tons and tons and tons of kind of generic grunts that the G.I. Joes go through all the time, and then every so often you will have someone big like Cobra Commander, or the Baroness, or Destro. You will deal with those people on a fairly regular basis, but a lot of times, most of the people that you're fighting are going to be grunts. Kind of like the minions in Power Rangers, like putties or piranhatrons, things like that. However, one of the kind of unique things about G.I. Joe is, I mentioned in the lore, it was for the most part G.I. Joe versus Cobra, but they have expanded the they have expanded the number of kind of bad guys to include other groups as well. There's a bunch of different mercenary groups that work with Cobra every so often. So you have people like the Crimson Guard, the what are they called? The Dreadnoks is another group. You have Zartan specifically, who works with a bunch of, he specifically is the leader of the Dreadnoks. You have the Red Ninja clan. So you have all these ninjas and stuff like that, and they tend to run into difficulties dealing with Snake Eyes and all the different ninja people. So when you're running a G.I. Joe game, you're trying to figure out what enemies you're going to be going up against. You technically have a couple different groups. You can have just regular Cobra people that you're dealing with. You can have the Dreadnoks and Zartan dealing with them, or you can have the Red Ninjas and stuff like that. And so you have these kind of 3 different bad guy groups, with Cobra being the biggest and these other small mercenary groups coming in every so often to help. And that gives you a lot of kind of flexibility when you're trying to do interesting things with the game in general. So yeah, overall, the threats are the threats. There's enough kind of generic bad guys and then named bad guys in the book here to have a lot of different things going on. And again, one of the things that happens a lot is, if you meet Zartan on a mission, you're generally not going to kill him. And a lot of times you're not even going to be able to capture him. He's going to be able to go away, but his kind of grunts are the ones that you're going to be able to defeat. And that's something that happened in the cartoons all the time, is, these big names would show up and then they would flee at the very end because bad guys are cowards and things like that. So that's generally what you're going to see with any named characters. You're really not going to be, quote unquote, killing them often, but you may capture them, and then a later campaign mission might be, they're trying to break out Zartan, try and stop them, or Zartan broke out, now you have to go recapture him, things like that. So yeah, overall the threats are interesting and fun and cool. And then they also have vehicle threats, because again, vehicles are a big part. We'll talk about that more in the next section here. But yeah, so in addition to dealing with just creatures and threats, you're also going to have to be dealing with the vehicles that they come in. Yeah, they're really cool. Things like the Hiss high-speed sentry is effectively a Cobra tank, is the best way to do it. It's a tank that has dual treads, but it kind of sits up like this because it has a gun, and the treads are down. Let's see if I can get this up high enough. The treads are like here, and then it goes up, and then the gun is up here, and that's how it goes. So it's the Hiss high-speed sentry. And you get a lot of, snake-themed things, like the Fang, fully armored Negator gyrocopter. Wow. Negator. That seems like a very, very bad. Anyway, so yeah, those are the big things. And it's one of the things that, again, is unique about the G.I. Joe RPG, is there's such a large emphasis on vehicles in general, whereas the other ones, they might have, 2, 3, 4 vehicles, or in the case of Power Rangers, you have Zords, but those aren't generic vehicles. The Zords are characters in and of themselves, and they grow and change with the Power Rangers. And the Transformers are vehicles already, but having a separate section for vehicles, I think, is really interesting and fun. So, yeah, moving on. Let's talk about equipment and items. As I mentioned before, the SS-20 system in general puts actually a pretty big emphasis on your gear is just as important as your character, which isn't something that happens in a lot of other RPGs. If you look at something like I'm currently running a campaign using the Cypher system. The Cypher system simplifies everything down to you have light weapons, medium weapons, heavy weapons. And that's it. It doesn't really make a differentiation between a katana and a rapier. They're both generally going to be medium weapons. A great sword and a maul are both heavy weapons, and they work generally the same way. You look at the Essence 20 system, and to give you an example, a close combat blade versus a close combat bludgeoning actually fight differently. They can both use either finesse or might to be able to attack, but the close combat bludgeon does blunt damage versus sharp damage versus the blade, but the close combat bludgeon actually has an alternate effect where you can take a downshift 1 and do 1 stun damage instead of blunt damage. So even something as simple as a knife versus just a club or a baton, you will play. It will make your character play differently because stun works very, very differently than blunt, and can massively change how combat is going to go. So yeah, as far as equipment and that, the other thing that's kind of unique about the Essence 20 system in general is they have an upgrade system. So you'll have things like a close combat bludgeon, which is a standard weapon, but maybe you want something that's a little bit more interesting. You want to do something different, like instead of just having a baton, let's stay. So we could call it an extended baton. So instead of it being, just this little thing, it turns into maybe a staff. And now your close combat bludgeon is now large enough so that you can reach with it. Or maybe in the extend is not physically setting it. Maybe it's adding a rope to it. So now instead of it just being a baton, it has a bit of a chain to it, and so the end of it can go out and do bludgeoning damage from a distance. You have a bunch of things. You have modular standard weapon. So basically a second weapon is built into the primary weapon. So maybe you have a pistol, but you also want to have something to do if someone gets really, really close. So you have effectively a bayonet on your pistol. And now you have a gun blade. These are all weapon upgrades, and there's a very simple to understand system of how to do them. The availability of all these upgrades is either standard, limited, restricted, prototypical, or unique. And depending on that, when you requisition your weapons at the beginning of a mission, a more complicated weapon will have a higher roll that you have to make, and you have only so many rolls you can make before a mission. But in addition to that, something that is unique to G.I. Joe is you also have what's called battle dress. Battle dress is your armor. Now, there is armor in the Transformers RPG, there's armor in the Power Rangers RPG. Neither of them make a lot of sense for those two systems. They work, but for the most part, it's just a change to your toughness score. That's really all they do, is they modify your toughness score, which isn't outside the realm of reason as far as armor is concerned. If you think about 5th edition to the D&D, or D&D in general, armor really just changes your armor class. That's all it does. Every so often, you'll have armor that has special abilities built into it, like adamantine armor is immune to critical hits. Or mithril armor is super light. So if you had like a mithril breastplate, normally you'd have disadvantage on stealth. You don't have it with mithril. So that in general, that's all it is. For G.I. Joe, you have your basic battle dress, that's your armor, and there's different versions of it. But in addition to it changing your toughness, or some of them change your evasion. You also have battle dress upgrades. And there are also traits. There are 4 different traits that your battle dress can have. Computerized means it has basically it has like a heads-up display and does stuff like that. Deflective does different things. Plating does different things, and there's silent, which makes it easier to move around in. So you have those different things, but then you get to the battle dress upgrades. And so you can do things like add a sensor system to it, and that will give it the computerized trait. So that means that you have sensors and a heads-up display or things like that. You can make it acclimating, which means it ignores the penalty for wearing inappropriate attire in your current environment. So let's say you're in a very cold environment. Acclimating armor would automatically make sure that you're warm. While in the same way, that same acclimating battle dress, if you're in a really hot situation, might have air conditioning built into it or something like that. So, again, not only is your weaponry going to massively change how you play your character, but also your battle dress is something that is going to change things. And it's not just going to be it's not just going to be kind of passive bonus. Like one of the upgrades is called Energized. And what it does is choose an element type. Your battle dress generates an aura of that element. When an enemy targets you with an attack with range measured in reach, they must make the attack downshift 2 or let you make an immediate attack with your element aura. Element auras can be made with might or finesse and deal 1 element damage on a successful hit. So effectively, you have a you get to attack them when they attack you in reach. And it does some kind of element, and there's a lot of different ways you can kind of flavor that. And other things like grasshopper braces. You get evasion +1 in addition to the battle dress's normal effects, and your jump distance is doubled when wearing this armor. So as you can see, just by having grasshopper braces built into your battle dress, you are going to change how your character plays, because now you can you can jump twice as far. So maybe you're using your jump, and maybe you use the grasshopper braces to get in close with enemies, so you can use your melee abilities as quickly as possible. Or you might use your grasshopper braces to get you into the perfect sniping position where there's no one that can get anywhere near you unless they're trying to shoot at you. And if you've got cover and things like that, you're going to be very difficult to hit. All these different things exist to heavily customize your character. And because of that, the G.I Joe RPG, you're going to be doing tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of customization based on your let's try this one more time. Based on your equipment, more so than your roles. And I guess I forgot to mention the roles in here. The roles that they have are Commando, Infantry, Officer, Ranger, Renegade, Technician, and Vanguard. So they do still have the roles. They still do have focuses, like to give an example, for the infantry, easy for me to say. You have either an artillery focused or mechanized infantry focused, and mechanized infantry specifically is at home behind the wheel is your first level ability. Increase the speed essence by 1 at first level and again at 10th level. And you gain an upshift 2 to driving skills tests. As I mentioned before, the other kind of interesting thing about the equipment is there's an entire section called vehicles. And so if you are a mechanized infantry character, you probably won't go too far without one of your vehicles. And there's tons of different vehicles. There's jump jet packs. There are what's called a killer whale, which is warrior hovering assault launch envoy, which is basically a hovercraft that is dressed to the nines in guns, bazookas, and missiles. There's surveillance cycle, reconnaissance sled, rapid attack motorcycle. There's just tons and tons and tons and tons. There's there's a shark sub and Skyhawk and a Sky Strike. There's so many different vehicles, and so that might be what your focus is, and you might be using vehicles a ton, or you might be a little bit more like Snake Eyes, where you're much more about one-to-one, man-on-man, man-to-man. Wow. It's been a long day, folks. Fighting man-to-man stuff. We're just gonna move. We're gonna move on from that, folks. Just stop it. I know what you're doing right now. Just stop it. Next section. Moving on. GMing the game. Running the G.I. Joe system, again, is going to be very similar to running any Essence 20 system. Get used to using your upshifts and downshifts often. It's one of the easiest ways to reward players for doing things. One of the things that I struggled with when I first started running Essence 20 is I'm very used to using the advantage-disadvantage system from D&D 5th edition. So I would almost always give edges and snags, and I would kind of forget that the shift system works. And depending on whether or not they're specialized, upshifting can be significantly more advantageous to them than giving them an edge or a snag. So really ensure that you're using everything available to you. Reward story points for good role playing. Give edges and snags where it seems appropriate. Give them upshifts and downshifts where it seems appropriate. You have so many different tools to use. In addition to that, roles in Essence 20 are what I call negotiated roles. What I mean by that is because everything is so generic by intent, there might be a situation where multiple skills and multiple specializations might work. There isn't a defined list of specializations in Essence 20. You can specialize in anything. There is a defined list of skills. And so what can happen is maybe they're trying to sneak into a construction site. This is something that has happened in one of the games that I've run. You need to sneak through this construction site for whatever reason. Maybe they're using it as a shortcut home to use the Animorphs as an example. Well, there's a fence there. And so they go, well, I just want to climb the fence. And so, okay, make me an athletics. I think that's what it's called. Yeah, make me a strength athletics check. Well, you know what? I don't want to just like brute force my way up. I want to kind of like get a run and then kind of run up and flip over the fence. Can I use my finesse instead? Well, yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I specifically have a specialization in parkour and free running. Can I use that specialization? Yeah, that makes sense. What started as a strength athletics check turned into a speed finesse with a parkour specialization. And that's how a lot of your roles should go. Outside of combat, you're going to be having this kind of negotiation where you're going to say, hey, give me this role. Or you might go, hey, give me either an athletics or a finesse check for this particular thing, whether you want to climb up it or finesse your way over it. And then the player will go, okay, well, I'm going to use my finesse. Or, hey, can I use this particular thing instead? Or can I help them with my perception? I'd like to help this person with my smarts perception skill because I'm going to kind of look and tell them where the best handholds are for them to get it over as quick as possible. There should be a bit of a negotiation. Now, it shouldn't turn into every single roll is 20 minutes of, well, I want to use this ability. No, I want to use this skill. Can I use this specialization? No. There really should only be maybe one or two negotiations in any single roll. And a lot of times your rolls are not going to be super heavily negotiated. It should take less than a couple of seconds. Hey, give me a finesse roll for this. Hey, I'm specialized in this. Can I use that? Yes, you can. No, you can't. Moving on. That should be a part of running it. And then specifically for running G.I. Joe, like I said, vehicles are a big part of this, even more so than any other system. So you should get a good idea about how vehicles work, how many characters can fit inside a vehicle, because after they take out the vehicle, the people inside might come out and have that combat going on. So having these multi-staged combats is something that can happen a lot in G.I. Joe, or exploding the vehicle may just take all of the riders out of combat. If they're in a plane, the joke in G.I. Joe is anytime a plane is shot down, you see the plane going and exploding, and then you see a parachute appear, and the person gets out safe, because nobody dies in G.I. Joe, at least not in the cartoon. In the comics, lots of people die. It's real bad. So as a GM running this, familiarize yourself with the various vehicles, the ones for Cobra, the ones for G.I. Joe, and make sure that you're using them often. Again, in the other Essence 20 system, I mean, the Zords, yeah, you'll be using that a lot, but the enemies generally don't get Zords. So it's mostly up to the players to know how their vehicle specifically works, and how driving works, and how their stat blocks and all that stuff works. In G.I. Joe, you're going to need to know a lot more about how vehicles... Is it super complicated? Absolutely not. But understand that you have vehicles, and then you can have these kind of two-stage combats where if you get rid of the vehicle, well, now you have to deal with the people inside it, and that can add some really interesting dynamics to your combat that just doesn't really exist. And vehicles can come in and provide cover for, like big jets. If you're having combat between your Joes and Cobra, and they're all on the ground, a big jet is not going to just fly in the air raining down stuff. It's going to come by and do a flyby, and maybe do it once. But like turning a jet around takes a lot of space and time. So the likelihood of every 6 seconds and the jet coming back isn't happening. You might get 1 or 2 passes in entire, 6 or 7 rounds of combat. So understand that having vehicles just come in at one point, or having the players have that option as well, those are all really, really interesting things that makes G.I. Joe that much more interesting and fun. In addition, because of just how much G.I. Joe is going to be a little bit more emphasis on ranged weapons and guns and things like that, because that's how the TV show works. When you're creating situations for them, don't forget to provide an interesting arena for them to combat in. If they're in the forest, make sure to describe, well, there's various trees, or if they're in a quarry, there's a pile of rocks over here that you can use for cover, or there's a ramp that goes up over here, and this is 30 feet above you there, to give them different elevations and things like that. You don't need to use actual maps and minis or anything, but make sure that you're creating something more than, hey, you're fighting in a nondescript box, because that's going to give them the most advantageous use of vehicles, of their abilities, of their weapons, everything. So, yeah. Moving on. Let's talk about additional resources. The G.I. Joe RPG. It's made by Renegade Studios. They're great people. And they do have a decent number of stuff. Like you can get G.I. Joe dice and Cobra dice and stuff like that. They do have form-fillable character sheets that I will have a link in the description down below for you to get that. I believe they also, when it first came out, they had a bunch of free stuff that came out that I'm just looking for the additional. There we go. Free bonus content, which I'll have a link as well. And the free bonus content, I believe, was a bunch of pre-generated characters, which is basically they had like Snake Eyes and Duke and stuff like that. which were useful. And then I believe the other free bonus content was... I think it was mostly... I have it on my computer. I just can't find it right now. I believe it's mostly just pre-generated characters and a couple other aids, things like order of operations and combat and stuff like that. In addition to that, they do have... they do have a hardcover adventure that they released that I'm trying to remember the name. I just saw it. Core book. Operation Cold Iron is the adventure, and then there was a convention adventure that they did. There's a bunch of different adventures, and they all also have a Cobra Cortex source book that I believe is coming out. I don't think it's out yet. So there's some additional stuff that you can get. It's all done through Renegade Game Studio, so you can go there and pick it all up. So, yeah. Moving on. So, final thoughts. Overall, the G.I Joe RPG, again, it's an Essence 20 game. I like the Essence 20 system. I think it's a solid system. The core book itself is solid. It's not quite as solid as the the Transformers core book, because this was the second book that came out, and by the time they got to Transformers, they finally really understood the system and how to do it. But it's better than the Power Rangers one. It's got just about everything that you need to be able to run an entire campaign. Compared to like the Power Rangers one where you really didn't have enough to run a campaign. And they're coming up with more stuff for it. So overall, I think it's really fun. And even if you're not a fan of G.I. Joe, if you just want to run adventures involving people that have some kind of a military style background, whether it's official military or they're just very, very skilled in combat in general, for whatever reason, and have a lot of cool gadgets and stuff added to them. Like, that's basically what G.I. Joe is. It's people with a lot of guns and a lot of cool technology and vehicles, generally, that also have a lot of guns on them. So there's a lot of different ways that you can reflavor it, but the core system in and of itself is great, and I really, really enjoy it. Otherwise, that is going to be all for me today. As always, if you enjoyed this, remember, like, subscribe, hit the bell icon to turn notifications on. In the comments down below, what kind of Joe would you want to see? The next 3 videos in this series on this channel are going to be designing new dragons, and I'm going to be making a bunch of G.I. Joes. So I'd be interested to hear the kind of stuff that you guys would want to play. Maybe I'll use one of those as a character. Maybe I won't that I build. It all depends on what you guys say. But I'd be interested to know, do you want to be a Snake Eyes style ninja character? Do you want to be like Duke, where you're just kind of in command and kind of lead from the rear, or sometimes lead from the front? Do you want to be like Roadblock and just have lots of big guns that do it? Let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, again, this is all for me today, and I'll see you guys next time. All right? Bye-bye.